to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer. This is Dr. Greer, and I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks to bring you an update and some perspective on things happening in the world around disclosureproject.org and CSETI.org and what we're doing with extraterrestrial contact and disclosure. And I'd like to welcome to the show today Dr. Ted Loder, who's on the board of directors of CSETI and is also our science advisor. And we are going to be focusing on what's been happening with the space program in the United States and actually throughout the world, and what's really going on, in our opinion, behind the scenes with the space program and why the changes that you've been hearing about are happening. As many of you may know, there have been a number of changes where they have discontinued certain programs. The Space Shuttle has been mothballed and has had its last flight. There is now the International Space Station, which is being serviced by Russian missions, and then the Russian missions right now are grounded because they've had problems with their launch vehicles. And the question, of course, becomes, where is the direction? Well, the public direction that they're stating is basically to privatize it and for taxpayer money through NASA to begin to go to private corporations to develop space exploration on their own, where there would be grants and what have you coming from taxpayers and NASA to various corporations. And so this is a whole area of discussion. It first was brought to my attention as an issue for us to address in an interview I did a couple of months ago with the Australian Broadcasting Network in Australia. And in looking at this and knowing what we know about what is happening in classified programs and what we've had in classified programs, we think that the public really needs to know what's going on behind the scenes. So that's really the focus for today's program, and then we'll get off into some other issues about the kind of technologies that actually exist that are out of the box, out of the box thinking, but they're on the black shelf, as it were. And that's why we have Dr. Ted Loder on the show to sort of talk about some of those issues in sciences. And so I'd like to welcome him here to the show. Thank you, Ted.
Well, thank you. I thought I'd pop in here perhaps initially here. It's very interesting when NASA announced that it would be shutting down the shuttle program or ending it or discontinuing it. I think it's their term, discontinuing it. It was interesting because there was no viable replacement for the shuttle program. This is a program that's gone on for approximately 30 years. There were originally 6 shuttles, I believe. We lost 2 of them due to accidents, along with 2 disasters, and 14 astronauts were killed in accidents. And the Challenger, as people are aware of, and the other one. And 4 shuttles remain, and those are the ones they've been using for the last few years.
Right.
Some of the public regions included, if you go to Google or ask.com or Yahoo questions or, any of these sort of public internet groups to find out things, they'll say, well, we've had 2 disasters. The shuttles are not very safe. There were many close calls. There were poor to no emergency escape methods for the shuttles. I mean, the earlier capsules, the Mercury capsule and some of the others, early on, the Apollo missions had escape methods so the astronauts could escape if there were problems. But basically, the shuttle does not have that capability. And, of course, the reason they always sort of fall back on is they were very expensive, incredibly expensive, actually, when you look at it. Approximately 450, I've seen various numbers, but the last number I saw was $450 million per launch, which includes massive amounts of training and whatever else. And considering there were typically 7 astronauts, they could take shuttle could take a couple more, but 7 was sort of a typical crew load on the shuttle. That's $7 to $450 million is a lot of money per astronaut to get them up there. So that's definitely part of the problem. And the other excuse that's often given or reason is that we need the money that's going into the present shuttle program to develop more advanced systems and cheaper shuttles. NASA, quote, has been working on an Orion spacecraft which is not, there have been no at least public launches of this that I'm aware of. And so it sort of goes on. Meanwhile, as Steve mentioned, they've turned delivery services over to the Russians, and we pay them. An interesting turn of events over the many decades that we've watched the space program. So with that background, one sort of scratches their head saying, they've had this thing, they've known they're going to run out of these things for 30 years since they initially built them. The technology is all, what has NASA been doing, and why hasn't it developed something to replace it in time or in good time? And the answer, as you will hear from the program, is they and others have, but as somebody noted recently about this topic, those folks that have the technologies don't like to have other people play in their sandbox. So I'll let that be a start to our discussion, Steve.
Right, and I think one of the things to me about this that's very scandalous is that the director of the Disclosure Project, and people can go to www.disclosureproject.org to see the kind of work we've been doing over the last 10 to 20 years. I have had the opportunity and honor to interview now hundreds of people who've worked in classified programs, including many people in the aerospace industry, which, of course, as many of you may recall, my maternal uncle, my oldest uncle, was the senior project engineer for the lunar module, which put the first man on the moon. His company was, he worked for Grumman, which became Northrop Grumman. And many of the people who worked in these programs who had some knowledge of the secret space program, very high-tech electromagnetic-gravitic and so-called anti-gravity type systems, which began to be really studied full bore in the 40s and 50s, and by the late 50s were developed. We really thought that at some point we would transition out of these explosive things that are really like a Roman candle with a bunch of guys sitting on it being shot off into space at 25,000 miles per hour. And basically it's a controlled bomb that they're sitting on, which is why there's been so much loss of life. It's not that there's no science behind it, but it's just inherently dangerous. And I want to remind people that the rocket was invented by Wernher von Braun, whose spokeswoman for the last few years of his life was a member of our team and is a member of our team. And this was, of course, in the early 40s when he developed the V-2 rocket for Adolf Hitler. And the basic rocket technology of that era is with some refinements, is what we're still using today, some 70 years later. Meanwhile, the big breakthroughs that have happened in propulsion and energy in the 40s and 50s and 60s that deal with zero-point energy, so-called anti-gravity propulsion systems, gravity control, these have all been kept secret and have gone into what are called black project, or the proper term is unacknowledged projects. And so that there is sort of this farce where we have two space programs. We have a secret space program where you have really top secret operations that go on with Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Skunk Works and some of these other high-tech corporations, Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, MITRE Corporation, and others. And then you have what the public is told about. And unfortunately, like so many things, we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the years on these sort of antiquated circa 1940s rocket technologies when there has been already developed with our tax money these other classified and secret technologies. And not only has there been an enormous waste of money from the public treasury, but there's the waste of not only treasure but blood, and that is the loss of life of these heroic men and women who've gone up into space where there have been these tragedies, such as Challenger. And this is a completely avoidable situation and is, frankly, shocking and outrageous. And I think that what we're seeing now is that there were many people who have come to me who worked in these projects in the 60s. And I'm thinking now of a guy who held many top-secret clearances and compartments, who in the 50s and early 60s and up through the Apollo era, worked for virtually every contractor back then. Hughes Aerospace, Lockheed. He actually had worked alongside Wernher von Braun in developing the Saturn rocket. And he at one point confronted Wernher von Braun and said, look, why don't we shelve this giant explosive rocket and bring out these other technologies that deal with these very high voltage anti-gravity systems, what the public would call flying saucers, that some of which, of course, are from other civilizations in space that people have seen, but many of them are man-made and are, in fact, part of a secret space program. And he said that Wernher von Braun put him inside and said, we will never speak of this again. And what was interesting about that is that this particular scientist, and I have seen his credentials, his badges, this man is for real. The problem, and he's a genius, the problem is that was over 40 years ago that conversation happened, almost 50. And so when you look at this, it's really a shame, but he told me that when I first met this gentleman in the 1990s, he says, well, we all thought that, okay, we're going to, there'll be a delay, like there are on many classified technologies. Eventually, these new technologies and new sciences will come out, and we'll transition into them. And so the 60s came and went, the 70s came and went, the 80s came and went. The 90s came and went. The 2000s came and went. And they never transitioned out these other technologies. They kept wanting to keep them secret. And the space shuttle became obsolete and rickety and got mothballed. So what has happened here is that there's this internal struggle that isn't talked about amongst the people who want to disclose these sciences and technologies and those who are hell-bent on keeping these secret for as long as they can, because when they come out, it means the end of oil, gas, coal, rockets, jet engines, internal combustion engines, centralized utilities, and, by the way, solar panels and windmills, which are, of course, windmills are from the 1800s or before then, actually. And the point being that the folks who are in the macroeconomic system who look at these things really always want to maintain the status quo because there are so many special, powerful interests that are in that domain. And so the scientific people who've dealt with these technologies who I've interviewed are appalled that these have not come out, but the reasons for it aren't technical. They're macroeconomic, geopolitical control. And that's what the public has to understand, and that's why the space shuttle, which, got pretty much put in use in 1980s, about 30 years ago, that one, I'm sure when that was coming online, there were people thinking, oh, well, these other things will come out soon. And so each decade comes and goes, and the people who are the folks driven by greed and power keep ruthlessly suppressing the release of these other technologies. Never mind we're destroying the environment of the world, and never mind we're in the Middle East with these wars over oil, which don't ever seem to end, and never mind that we have 40% of the population of Earth in such poverty that 40% of Earth's occupants do not even have plumbing, literally do not have a toilet to pee in. So what you find is that this is not a technical and scientific issue. That's been done and answered before, frankly, I was born. It's a social and macroeconomic and geopolitical problem. And this is what Eisenhower ran into in the late 50s when he was being stiff-armed out of the control of these projects. And this is why, if you look it up, and we have this at the disclosureproject.org site, Eisenhower, who was a five-star general, a military guy, a Republican, a conservative Republican, he basically said, look, in his last speech to the nation before he left office in January of 1961, just before John F. Kennedy took office, he said, beware the military-industrial complex. And the reason he said that was because he had lost control over this vast contractor world of moneyed interests that had kept these things secret, including the extraterrestrial part of it, but also and chiefly the science and technology part of it that would have at that time made ExxonMobil or whatever oil company obsolete and irrelevant, but that problem still exists in 2011. You have more people in the world using oil and gas and coal and little cars running around in China and India using petroleum than there were in 1960 or 1955. So the world is even more dependent on this poisonous, nasty stuff that's destroying the environment. And with that is an enormous amount of wealth and power, and it becomes more and more difficult. It's like this, George W. Bush himself called it this terminal addiction that we have to oil and fossil fuels, and that is really what's behind the fact that we ran out of the longevity of the space program and don't have anything to put in its place because. At a certain point, you can only take explosive rockets so far. You can't go that far with them. It takes forever to even get to Mars at that speed. Whereas with these other technologies, you probably get to Mars in a few minutes. So, because you're dealing with trans-dimensional technologies that can go beyond the speed of light. And I think that this is one of the big problems of where we are. Everyone thinks a lot of what the work we're doing is futuristic. I'm going, you know what? We're really just trying to catch the world up to where it could have been, it should have been around 1955 to 1960, and that everything since then has been sort of an arrested development. And that arrested development, which is very unnatural, has created these huge problems in the world in terms of poverty, environmental problems, Middle East entanglements where, let's face it, we're mainly in the Middle East because of oil. We're not there for any other reason. If it was just purely humanitarian reasons, we'd have 500,000 troops in countries in Africa or someplace. So we don't. And the reason we don't is because our concerns that when they say our national security interests in the Middle East, that's just code word for oil, basically. So I think that this is what has driven the policy behind what's happened with the space program. And the tragic thing is a lot of very good people with NASA and that people that my uncle worked with, they didn't have any control over these top secret technologies, and they had to do the best they could with what they were allowed to work with, which happened to be circa 1940s rocket technology.
Exactly. People, if you're listening to this for the first time, you kind of blink your eyes and say, well, this can't be true. I saw it on television or what have you. But I think I'd like to go back for a minute or so to the Disclosure Project, which is we did over 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. And those people who are listening to the World Pollution Network and have not looked at any of the material from the Disclosure Project at disclosureproject.org on the internet, look it up. There's some amazing information in there. And I'm just going to spend a minute or a couple minutes here just giving some quotes from some of the Disclosure Project witnesses. Steve mentioned he's talked to hundreds of people. I haven't talked to hundreds, but I've talked to many, many people, including many of the Disclosure Project witnesses that are in the book and on the videos that are part of the project. And an example, I'm going to go through 3 or 4 examples quickly here just to give you some flavor of it. The late Daniel Morris Salter, who is a retired NRO, National Reconnaissance Organization operative, who dealt with UFOs and the technology, stated on the record with us, UFOs are both extraterrestrial and man-made. And that he also noted that we were working with D. Townsend Brown, and who a lot of people are aware of, and doing anti-gravity work with him. a gentleman who was in Boeing Aerospace, we just have his initials AH at the time, noted during the interviews, most of the craft, again referring to these man-made craft, most of the craft operate on anti-gravity and electrogravitic propulsion. We're flying anti-gravity vehicles up there in Area 51 and in Utah right now. And this interview was done 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. Another gentleman, Dr. B, a scientist who worked in many, many top secrets all his life, noted in the interview, oh yes, anti-gravity. As a matter of fact, we used to have a lot of activity in Hughes Aircraft up in Malibu, a big think tank up there, big anti-gravity projects. But this is the important point. He said many important points, but one of them, but the American public will never hear about it. And then we have Captain Bill Uhouse, United States Marine Corps. He's retired. He was a fighter pilot, a whole bunch of activity dealing with aircraft and the test flights of exotic experimental aircraft. Read anti-gravity craft when you hear that term very often. He was working on flying disc simulators, and that went into operation in the early 1960s. Now that's critical that you really get your head around. Early 1960s. We're talking 50 years ago, or just about 50 years ago, that the military and covert projects were working on the anti-gravity craft. The simulator, he noted, wasn't even functional until 1958. That's over 50 years ago. And it was using large capacitors, millions of volts, and there was a number he noted when he was involved in it, and this is 30 years ago or more that he was involved in it. He was saying over the last 40 years or so, not counting simulators, there are 2 to 3 dozen in various sizes we built. Now remember, he was just dealing with the test pilot stuff, not the sort of thing that was done outside. This thing is so compartmentalized that people just worked on different aspects. He passed away just a couple of years ago. Mark McCandlish has spoken many times about alien reproduction vehicles. I won't go into that, but there are many others. And one other point that I want to mention is Ben Rich at Lockheed Skunk Works.
Oh, yes.
And in 1993, he was speaking with Jan Harzan, who was a senior executive at IBM in Orange County. I just spent some time with Jan just a few weeks ago out at the Orange County, a big UFO conference there. Anyway, Ben Rich, who was head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, had noted to Jan, and this is a quasi-quote, we already have the technology to take ET or extraterrestrials home. And later on, this is interesting because Harzan had asked Ben Rich, how does the UFO propulsion work? And Rich replied, let me ask you, how does ESP work? Harzan replied with a question, all points in time and space are connected? Rich replied, that's how it works. Now, so they're using technologies, transdimensional technology, and a lot of the UFOs are, quote, alien reproduction vehicles or anti-gravity craft are really just really fast machines. They just move really fast. They aren't doing transdimensional stuff. They just go like steak. And they in the anti-gravity or counter-gravity mode. But when you really get into ET technology that can literally move between points of space almost instantly, then you're dealing with transdimensional technologies. A new concept? No. Schrodinger in 1927 noted that this was indeed the case. That there's only one mind in the universe, and it's all connected to the same place as we are connected. So the thing gets really, as Dr. Greer mentioned in the beginning, outside the box. But these technologies are what would transform both our transportation technologies as well as our energy technologies, and they are just being suppressed.
Yeah, and the suppression has been ruthless, because we have encountered this with the OrionProject.org, where last year we had a man under contract who has worked on these transdimensional technologies, including space-time alteration and energy generation, propulsion, and basically a group of people, including a former CIA director who I know personally, went down to his command and threatened him and his family. And this was in the spring of 2010. This is not ancient history. And he was enjoined from any further assistance to us in bringing these technologies out. Now, frankly, this is a criminal behavior, and it is outrageous. But if you look at this and you listen to these various people and various men that have worked from the 50s onward with, the fact that you have talked about there being test pilot simulators to train the pilots by 58 and 60 and 62, that mean they had the operational discs that look like flying saucers already flying them, because you wouldn't have a simulator to train people in something unless they already had something to go into and then test fly. So, and I have actually personally interviewed people who have been these pilots of these things that look like flying saucers that are anti-gravity. Many of them don't want to come public with their name, rank, and serial number like many of the Disclosure Project witnesses have, because of fear of retribution or even death, frankly. But the point is that here we are, still spending untold billions of dollars at NASA, and now what they're going to be doing, they're going to be shoveling our tax dollars from the coffers of the Treasury to NASA, and from NASA to private corporations to develop more bogus stuff. Some refined version of the space shuttle, or some refined version of a something that would be in low Earth orbit. These other things, and it's really, it's interesting, because I have a friend who worked his whole career at NASA, mostly at NASA Ames Research Center out there in California, who said that basically this is white-collar welfare is what he used to call the NASA budget and his job, because he knew these other things existed. And he said this sort of with a sort of sardonic smile, but he said basically it is white-collar welfare, and that it's really like the Truman Show. It's like, let's do this and make people think this is really the state of the art, and gee, you're a rocket scientist. But you know what? Rockets were 1940s.
That's right. It's as they say, it's so yesterday.
And the other thing that Ben Rich said, and by the way, there was a PhD physicist who was there also at that meeting when Ben Rich said this, who has repeated this publicly, Dr. Hal Puthoff, where Ben Rich said, he basically said three things. He says, we already have the technologies to take ET home and to travel amongst the stars. And he said two other things. He says, almost anything you can imagine, we've already done at the Lockheed Skunk Works. And he also said there are no private conversations anywhere on Earth. And what's interesting about this is that this nexus where electromagnetism and the magnetic field and consciousness come together is really key. And this is why the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works referred to ESP. And this gets into this whole question of space, time, and mind, which, of course, is what CSETI is doing, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, very cutting-edge, sort of pioneering both diplomatic and scientific work, making contact with these extraterrestrial civilizations, because they're simply not using cell phones and radio waves. I got news flash. We're being visited by intelligent civilizations, and they ain't using circa late 1800s electromagnetic theory. And that's basically what your cell phone is. I don't care how fancy your iPhone is, and I have a new iPhone 4, it's fun, but it's still a piece of junk based on electromagnetic theory from the late 1800s, and all the other sciences that began to be experimented with, by the way, with people like Nikola Tesla and T. Townsend Brown. That information has all been kept secret and is in a black box. And one of the things Ben Rich had said was that, it would take these things are in a black box at the Lockheed Skunk Works and at other corporations, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. And when I heard that, I thought, well, you know what? we the people need to be that act of God and work together to bring this out, because we're killing the earth with the current paradigm. And we need to be able to liberate the entire planet from the yoke of this macroeconomic slavery that keeps most of the world in poverty while we destroy the environment and the oceans and the ozone layer and the polar ice caps melting. The whole problem we're facing with the environment is a catastrophe that we can fix, and we need to. And actually, this is what really propelled me to leave my medical career. And most people don't give up $400,000 or $500,000 a year as a doctor in the prime of their life to do stuff like this for virtually nothing. But the reason I did is I realized that we're going to run out of time with the current paradigm, and people need to take this seriously, and that's why we're doing the Disclosure Project. And by the way, those of you who want to come, we're doing a really something very fun to celebrate disclosure in Los Angeles on Sunday, the 25th of September. We're having a disclosure concert in Los Angeles. I'm going to be there, as are some musicians and DJs and some surprise of rather famous Hollywood folks who are going to show up. So those of you who are in the California area who want to come, you can find out about that at disclosureproject.org. I think it's going to be a lot of fun and a celebration of disclosure, and also a fundraiser for disclosureproject.org. So if you're in the area and want to come, please do.
Great. I wanted to add pop in here with something else. There have been, everybody says, well, where are these things? If we have them, how come we don't see them? Well, in reality, many people do. People have been reporting large triangular-shaped craft for literally decades, from the time of the Hudson Valley sightings, almost 2 decades ago now, to much more recent sightings in Europe and in Texas and all other places all over the country, large triangular-shaped craft. Now, some of these are extraterrestrial, and some of them are man-made.
Correct.
The names of these things, the sort of popular moniker name for these are TR-3Bs. They're anti-gravity, counter-gravity craft developed by Lockheed and others, a consortium of major aerospace corporations, and we've had them for decades. And they're becoming more and more old, shall we say, because the mainstream media continues to refuse to be open about this topic, which is
and really the truth is, even the ones who are open-minded to it, who I have met with, when they start to try to do a show about this, they get a visit from corporate who has gotten a visit from someone in the intelligence community, and they kill the project. I mean, the head of ABC News was given 35 digital hours of top-secret witness testimony that we have with the Disclosure Project. I have 110 hours, but I kind of boiled it down to my director's cut of 35 hours. And this senior executive with ABC wanted to do specials on this, and he says, boy, by God, I'm going to do this. And he visited me at my home, and he went through the material. And a couple weeks later, he calls me up and he says, Dr. Greer, I can't do this show. I said, well, I thought you were given a full sway to do this. And this is an Emmy Award-winning, very well-known investigative reporter who had worked before ABC News, had worked with 60 Minutes and with Mike Wallace and others. And he says, Dr. Greer, you know who they are, and they won't let me do it. And so this is part of the other part of this is that the reason the World Puja Network and other shows like this are so important is that, and with the Internet, is that we're able to reach people when the mainstream media is, quite frankly, blocked from it. I mean, I remember even being on a UFO-related show once, and it was back in 2004. almost 7 years ago, and the interviewer started asking me specifically the names of some of the people on this committee, keeping these sort of things away from the public and keeping it secret, and I started discussing them. And when I got to one name, that of Dick Cheney, they went to a commercial break, and they broke in. There was a voice that broke in on the line. And this is a live interview with millions of people listening. It was millions of people. And a voice broke in and said, "Dr. Greer, change the direction of this conversation now, or we are going to dump this show live." And they said it like they meant it. Now, the producers of the show and the guy interviewing me really did not know who this was breaking in, but you can only imagine. And it was certainly someone in the intelligence community monitoring this, but they did not want us to go there. And so one of the things that you find with this is that if these folks have enough power and money, and they do, to own and control a lot of the media and these large corporations, and they're willing to lie to the president or to members of Congress or intimidate people, they're then able to kind of keep the lid on that. And that's kind of what disclosureproject.org is up against. But that's how we've succeeded. It's by getting it out to literally millions of people who have heard about this. And the next phase of this is what we're looking at doing now. And there are many people who are not deceived. The vast majority of the public now, well over half of the population, believe there's intelligent life out there, and that we've been visited, and that some aspect of the government, maybe not the whole government, is keeping this secret. And in fact, I point out that the government that you and I think about, that we elect and that are appointed and are under the constitutional system, extremely few of them know anything about this. I have personally briefed sitting CIA directors. I've personally have briefed generals and admirals at the Pentagon who you would think, because of their high rank and position, would know of these subjects. And I'll come in there with documents and testimony and individuals as well who are witnesses and who know firsthand about these projects, and they'll look at me and say, "I've inquired about this, and I basically have been lied to." And so one of the things that has broken down and the reasons that the secrecy has been able to continue is exactly what Eisenhower warned us about, and that is that the power of the military-industrial complex and these secret organizations would be, and this is what Eisenhower said in this speech, a threat to our way of life and our democracy. And that is very true. And now it's not just a threat to our way of life and democracy, it's an existential threat to the life of the earth and to the health of the environment and the planet and the peace of the planet. So this is not a trivial issue. It's a very, very serious matter. And I can assure you, when I have a meeting with a member of Congress or a senator or someone at the Pentagon, no one is laughing either before or after the meeting. And yet, it tends to be the subject of just sort of frivolity and cartoonish sort of caricatures and the movies that have come out in the last year. If you were to believe that, of course, we have marauding aliens out there ready to attack us at every turn, when, of course, anyone who understands these technologies in the least know that civilizations that advanced, if they were hostile, it would have been over way back in the 40s when we detonated the first atomic bomb at the Trinity site at White Sands. I mean, it would have been point, set, match, over, gone, finished. And they're not hostile, but there are a lot of people who want to make a lot of hay. And this transitions to another issue about the secret space program, and that is, I'm convinced from the people I've spoken to, including a colonel who did the original briefings for Carter, President Carter, and then Reagan, to try to get them to buy into the SDI or Star Wars program, the so-called missile defense program, that one of the things he said the card they played was the, quote, alien threat card. And he said at the time they knew that was a complete hoax, but they were trying to manipulate the fears of our political leaders, and particularly Reagan, to go along with it. And there's actually a snippet that was on CNN very briefly when Reza Gorbachev was getting out of the limousine at the UN during the arms control negotiations, and Gorbachev's wife. And a person asked her, a journalist as she was getting out of her limousine there in New York at the UN, why don't we just get rid of all nuclear weapons? And she blurted out, no, we can't. We need some of them to fight the aliens. So they have used this sort of a completely hoaxed scenario that there's a threat from outer space to manipulate certain leaders into fear, when anyone who knows anything about the science behind transdimensional, faster than the speed of light technologies know that if there was a hostile threat out there, there would be no discussion. It'd be just over. And, everyone knows about MAD, mutual assured destruction, during the Cold War, that basically the Soviet Union and the United States had so many nuclear weapons that if anyone fired one of them, they would all be fired, and it would be the end of life on Earth. And that's circa 1950s nuclear fusion weapons with ICBMs going on rockets, which is a 1940s technology. So you have 40s, 50s era delivery systems and explosives, which are devastating, that could destroy life on Earth. If you're talking about civilizations that understand the fabric of space-time and go faster than the speed of light between and among star systems, if they were hostile, it would be point, set, match, over. And so, but you look at all these movies coming out in Hollywood, and you look at all this kind of manipulation to the extent that there has been any disclosure by these manipulators to any political leaders, it has been to get their cooperation through fear with these outrageous programs that are really just a way of keeping it secret and also enriching the military-industrial complex. Because, interestingly, a lot of people thought he had lost his mind, but Rumsfeld, right before, the day before 9/11, since this is, we're celebrating, or not celebrating, but remembering the 9/11 catastrophe, Donald Rumsfeld said just the day before 9/11, 10 years ago, that there was something like $2.3 trillion missing out of the Department of Defense budget over the last few decades. Now, I think people thought he meant billion. He meant trillion. So these trillions of missing dollars have gone into where? This stuff. And it's from the American taxpayers, and it's outrageous. And I think that it's curious to me that no one in the Tea Party world who alleged to be so concerned about debt and this kind of corruption have caught on to this yet. But maybe Ron Paul. But I think that what you find is that there's a huge amount of money that's siphoned off that goes into these programs, and a lot of that is being done, very frankly, illegally. And there's no other way to put it. It's a complete abuse of power and abuse of constitutional authority, or subversion of constitutional authority. And in the meanwhile, we end up as taxpayers being sold this bill of goods on the conventional NASA budget and program, where we're going to shovel more billions into bogus, antiquated technologies that, guess what, are going to go into corporate R&D programs. Meanwhile, it's outrageous. Meanwhile, the OrionProject.org has been looking for, $5 or $6 million in grant funding to put together these geniuses we've identified to come out with these energy generation technologies so that we could at least catch up to where we should have been 50 years ago in terms of getting our homes and cars to run on clean energy from the fabric of space around us, the so-called zero-point energy field. And by the way, the zero-point energy field was proven in the Casimir effect, I believe, in the 50s by a physicist.
Yeah, it's been known that there's been other experiments to show this, the same fact that it exists. And this was talked about and discussed by Dirac back in the 20s.
Correct.
And in fact, even how to do it, and certainly Tesla was capable and did extract energy from that field, et cetera. So this is not new stuff. That's the discouraging about. You feel like when you're talking about this, when you're talking about anti-gravity or these energy technologies, that is cutting-edge stuff. In reality, it's been around for at least a half a century, much of it, if not more. T. Townsend Brown did his first experiments with electrogravitic stuff in the 20s, in the late 1920s, 27.
Correct.
He went his first work on that, and by mid-50s they had figured out how to do it, and by, as we noted earlier, late 50s, early 60s, we had applied that science and that engineering to actually build a craft that worked and that could work. And so since then, there's been 50 years of development since then, and there's basically a parallel scientific establishment and engineering establishment on this planet. And there's this rogue covert group that has this technology, which they built financially on the backs of everybody else for their own purposes. And I continually hear, and Dr. Greer has heard this as well, we shouldn't let this technology out because it might be used for evil purposes. Well, so do bread knives and everything else, and I think there are ways to control that. The average Joe is not going to build an anti-gravity craft. They're pretty expensive to build, et cetera, particularly one-offs. So that's not going to be, but slowly integrating it into our technology, except beyond the B-2 bomber and other such stealth aircraft that people are aware of, but integrating it into our normal Boeing aircraft flying across the country would have a major change in our economics, as Steve mentioned. I want to add one other thing here. We're getting close to the end here, and that is the concept of disclosure, after disclosure, open disclosure, etc. I was at a conference recently, and one of the themes of the conference was what happens after disclosure of all this information. And as we mentioned earlier, it's going to be a cascading effect, not only with energy, transportation technologies, and a whole bunch of technologies, communications technologies, etc. In actual fact, disclosure has occurred. The Disclosure Project, so named, who really sort of started the major ball rolling on this 10 years ago, certainly elucidated and explained a lot of these technologies and the reality of not only the ET presence, but also the rogue programs that have been developing this stuff. So in a sense, that disclosure has happened. Now, but however, what hasn't happened is what I've termed open disclosure. And open disclosure, by my definition anyway, is one in which the existence of extraterrestrials visiting this planet and of human technologies dealing with some of these exotic technologies is openly discussed not only by the major media, but also our leaders, president, vice president, on down and on up. So it's known worldwide, it's admitted to. That's what I've termed open disclosure. And frankly, much to my disappointment and many of our disappointment, it has not happened yet. Disclosure itself is interesting. Even President Truman acknowledged at some point during one of his speeches the existence of extraterrestrials, and it's certainly been acknowledged by major rocket scientists and whatever in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But that's all sort of been lost in the sands of time here, in the confusion of time, and it is not openly acknowledged. And until open acknowledgement and open disclosure occurs, we just have to keep fighting the battle in terms of explaining to people the reality of what truly exists and the world that could be once these technologies are made available to the human population of this planet.
Right, and what a magnificent world it would be. Imagine abundance, the end of poverty in a generation, a clean environment, silently going from city to city in these anti-gravity vehicles without any noise, never having to pay an electric bill or a gasoline bill again, never, et cetera, and so on. It would be a complete transformation of the way we live on planet Earth, and it's long overdue. It's 50, 60, 80 years overdue. The other point I make to people, I'm the point guy that's had to do a lot of these briefings for folks like the CIA director and members of Congress and admirals and generals at the Pentagon and what have you, is that the dysfunction, the structural failure in our system is so severe, and this is what Eisenhower was warning us about, that at the end of one of these briefings I was doing for President Clinton's first CIA director, our James Woolsey, and I said, and I gave him a white paper that's in the first book that I published called Extraterrestrial Contact, The Evidence and Implications, and you can get that at disclosureproject.org. And in this white paper, I was recommending the actions that need to be taken under an executive order to get these programs under control and disclose them. And he looked at me, and this is a CIA director. He says, yes, Dr. Greer, but how do we disclose that which we have no access to? And so here's a problem. Knowing about it doesn't mean controlling it. So we put together a briefing for Obama. I know it was hand-delivered to him and also to the CIA Director Panetta and Secretary of Defense Gates, who's now left, and Panetta is now the Secretary of Defense, the head of the House Intelligence Committee. We put all this together, but them knowing about it and having control over these projects are two separate things. And the thing that really was chilling for me, and sort of my coming to age on this, happened in 1993, when I realized that there was basically a coup d'etat that happened in the 50s, where the people that we elect and that we think run the government really don't. And that there's this shadowy group that calls the shots on this, and they don't mind lying to or even threatening, and I think in some cases killing these sort of leaders. And so a lot of people make the mistake by thinking, well, if the president knows about, and this is the mistake I made in 1993, if the president knows about this and his top national security team, and they want to see this change happen that could benefit the world, they can make it happen. Well, yes and no, because people have to understand that just because you are read into or briefed on a project, which is a lot of what I do, and I'll get top secret documents handed to me, I'll get all kinds of information, actionable intelligence as they call it, get it to these people. But then, I'll give you an example. There was a man who was an admiral in charge of intelligence for the Joint Staff that I gave a document to that actually had the project code numbers and code names on it. Before I went to the briefing at the Pentagon for him, I gave him this packet. He contacted one of those operations, and he said, look, I'm Admiral so-and-so. I want to be briefed on this project. He said read into, which is military speak for briefed. And the person on the other end said, yes, sir, we know who you are, but we cannot discuss this project with you. You don't have a need to know. And he says, damn it, I'm the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. How can I not have a need to know? And they said, sir, we cannot discuss this with you further. Goodbye. Click, and blocked him. Would not return a call again. This to one of the most powerful military figures in the United States establishment. So this is not science fiction. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not a movie out of Hollywood. This is the life I have seen, and I know personally this to be the case. So one of the problems is that being how dysfunctional our system has become, I think it's really up to us, the people, to do disclosure, to educate people, to identify scientists who understand this new physics, to fund a facility where they can work safely and bring these technologies out. I think we have to do this. And, I'm not saying that we should give up on our elected leaders, and we need to continue to educate them and hope they have the courage to take this on. But in reality, what I have observed is so frequently, even if they want to, they can't. Someone who worked very closely with President Carter told me that when Carter was pushing on this subject, because he had a UFO sighting when he was governor of Georgia, and actually I have his report of this UFO sighting he had near Fort Benning. It may have in fact been one of our own anti-gravity devices. But whatever it was, he saw something extraordinary, and so he took an interest in the subject. When he became president, this was the first thing he asked about from George Bush, the CIA director, who later became president, the father of W. And he was told by George Bush, the CIA director at the time, in 1977 when he became president, when Carter became president, that he would not be briefed on this subject, that if he wanted to find out about it, ask the Congressional Research Service to look into it. Totally brushed off an incoming president, and this I know to be a fact. When Carter tried to organize a White House study on this, he then got visited by a couple of suits, not sure what agency, and they basically came to the Oval Office and told Carter, sir, if you would like to complete your first term in office, you will keep your mouth shut about this subject. And the people who had been commissioned with doing this White House study on UFOs, the Stanford Research Institute, SRI International, basically were ordered by some of these folks to not do this study, even though the President of the United States had ordered it. And they were told that if they proceeded with the study, that SRI would lose all their other contracts from the defense industry, the Department of Defense. And so they dropped it. So this, and we have an affidavit to this effect, by the way, in disclosureproject.org. So this is what the system is, and I think most people, it's a very steep learning curve. We're just kind of touching the high points here, but you can learn more at disclosureproject.org, and there's a book that's nearly 600 pages that has the testimony and the documents that we're referring to in it called Disclosure, and I would advise people who have an interest in this to look into it. And one other thing, we are going to be gathering, CSETI's having an expedition out under the stars to be ambassadors and make contact with these intelligent civilizations coming here. We're going to be October 23rd to the 29th in Southern California in a remote desert location, and there still may be a couple of places open for that. If you want to join us, go to cseti.org to find out more. And again, if you can make it to the Disclosure Concert, which is really a celebration of 10 years of the Disclosure Project, and during which time there are now over a dozen other nations that have opened their UFO files, from Chile to Mexico to Denmark to France and even the United Kingdom. And we're going to have a fun time. It will be a night of celebration and music and dancing, and just a great time in Los Angeles, there in Hollywood, at the famous Avalon facility, and I think it's just going to be a great event. Those of you who want to join us for that, it'll be on September 25th, that's Sunday the 25th, from 9 o'clock in the evening till about 1 a.m., or we'll just see how late we go. So I hope to see some of you there. I will be there. So again, I'd like to thank Dr. Loder for his insight on this and research, and great work over the years for Disclosure Project and the OrionProject.org. And I'd like to also thank the World Puja Network for hosting us every 2 weeks to give you an update on the kind of work we're doing. And I hope to see all of you soon in Los Angeles, or perhaps out under the stars. All right.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.